Welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to talk about the difference between working as a developer in a creative agency versus working as a developer in a product company, which would be something like Airbnb or Dropbox or whatever, a place that produces a product. There are some key differences that I think are worth exploring, and a lot of times you hear these two situations kind of pitted against each other as one versus the other and kind of painted in broad brush strokes, but I wanted to kind of parse some of the key differences today. So in order to do that, I wanted to talk about three distinct areas. Number one, the work itself, the nature of the work, what is it like? Number two, the pay, and number three, the quality of life. Now, as I said, these stereotypes usually favor one over the other in those three areas, and I wanted to kind of go through those today and see if I think that's actually the case. So I wanted to go ahead and get it out there right at the top that I've worked in agencies for the majority of my career, and I've never truly worked in a product company as an employee, but while I was at one of those agencies, I worked at a large Fortune 500 company for over a year. So I feel like I've gotten a view into what it's like at each kind of place. Okay, so let's get into each of those three areas. First, starting with the work itself. What is it like? What are the key differences? So first, I would say a stereotype of agency work is that you get a bunch of variety, and a stereotype of product company work is that it's pretty one-dimensional. And to a certain extent, I would say that's true-ish. I can see how that would be considered to be the case. As an employee at an agency, I've gotten to work with a lot of different clients on a lot of different projects in a lot of different fields and industries, and that's been really interesting. And I could see how if you're, for example, at Airbnb, you could be limited in that sense. You're working on the product, which is to help people rent their homes out, right? And you know that to a certain extent, it's always going to revolve around that topic to some degree. But I think there's variety in ways that you might not expect. So for example, because I work at an agency, I'm mostly building MVPs and products for startups a lot of the time, not all the time. But one example of something I've never encountered is I've never built an app that's been used by thousands and thousands of people. Whereas if I worked, say, at a Dropbox, that would definitely not be the case. I'd be building for scale. And so I think there's different kinds of variety, and I think it depends on whether you're talking about variety in stack, variety in how many users and the scale that you're building for, and variety in the industry you're working in. So you could really cut this a lot of different ways, and I don't know that I would say that, for example, one is definitively better than the other. As another example with Airbnb, maybe you're having to work on local government stuff, and you're having to think about managing fraud, and you're having to worry about verification, all these different kinds of things. So even though the product is revolving around maybe one kind of user or helping people to do one kind of thing, I think there can still be a lot of variety there. So I'm going to give this a tie. I think the variety is kind of what you make of it, and if you're really looking for it, you can find it in an agency or a product company. Okay, so let's talk about the pay. The stereotype of product companies, let's say Google, for example, or any other Bay Area company, is that they are just paying enormous salaries. And the stereotype of agencies is that maybe you'll get paid a little bit less, but you'll make up for it in terms of variety, like we just talked about, and maybe some other stuff. So is that true? In order to dissect this, I think we need to understand the business models a little bit more. So let's say I have Dropbox. They charge enterprise clients a yearly fee in order to use their service. And because of that, they have this magical thing called recurring revenue. So what that means is not without fail, but for the most part, once they've sold this product, they know that a certain number of their customers are going to continue to renew year after year. That's called your churn rate. So churn is the number of people that stop using it. And so because of that, a lot of times the income can scale far beyond the number of people. So for example, you could have a team of 10 engineers that builds a product, and because it's code and you can execute code infinitely, you can sell that product to, in theory, an infinite number of customers, and you might not need a really big team in order to do that. That's pretty well contrasted to an agency. An agency is essentially bundling a bunch of people's time and selling that. And so because an agency is essentially selling time and taking people's hours and kind of putting that in an attractive package and selling that to clients, that is a very, very different idea, because the revenue has to scale with the number of people. And so you know always that your profit margin is to a certain extent going to be tied to the number of people that you can hire, and you're going to hit a ceiling in how much you can earn with the current number of people that you have on staff that are billable. So I know that was a lot of explanation, but that is basically just my long way of saying that I think that product companies most likely have the edge in terms of pay, unless we're talking about an agency like McKinsey or a Deloitte Digital or a Slalom. For the most part, I think if if you're working with local kind of digital and creative agencies, probably the product company is going to beat them 9 times out of 10. So if salary is really important to you, you might want to look at a product company. Okay, on the other hand, let's talk about quality of life. So the stereotype here is that product companies are worse for quality of life, that you're working really, really long hours, and that agencies, generally speaking, it's a little bit better. I've heard horror stories about agencies as well, but I wanted to dig into this a little bit and see, can we really be guaranteed that the quality of life is going to be better in an agency rather than in a product company? Okay, so the argument for quality of life being better in an agency usually goes something like, well, an agency at the end of the day ultimately is just bundling time, as we discussed, and so it's actually not in the agency's best interest to have people work more than 40 hours a week consistently, because they're not able to bill for that time, because clients typically are only expecting to be billed for max 40 hours a week. So that's the argument that people typically talk about for agencies in terms of quality of life. And so assuming that's true, let's think about product companies. So Google, for example. Google and a lot of these really, really big companies have well-known programs which are called on-call. And that basically means what it sounds like, kind of like being a doctor, right? So you have a pager.
I'm not getting a sig on my beeper.
And you rotate who's on call throughout maybe a month. And when you're on call, you have the pager. And if something goes down that's mission critical, you are getting on your computer within, usually it's like 30 minutes or something. I think sometimes even less, perhaps like 15, something really pretty restrictive, which means you can't go to a concert or something, right? And so when you have the pager, you're on call. And if something happens, you're the person that has to fix it. And so I think a lot of people would look at stuff like that, look at, generally speaking, the expectation in a product company being that you're working long hours, which places like Google try to offset with offering a lot of food and other perks. And a lot of people would look at that stuff and say, clearly the quality of life is going to be better in an agency. Now, I don't know that every single agency is always only going to be having people working 40 hours a week, but I think in a general sense, we can assume that the quality of life is going to be better in an agency because of that argument I just shared with you about bundling and selling time. It's not in the agency's best interest to have people work consistently more than 40 hours a week, though that's not always the case. So that is more or less the 3 big areas I would say when considering agency versus product company. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. A lot of this has to do with what your interests are, what your career aspirations are, and what your priorities are. So this is more just me kind of telling it how I see it, and I would love to know your thoughts. Did I get something wrong? You disagree? Do you have something you want to add? Hit me up in the comments and let me know. If you're watching at this point, you would probably enjoy the rest of my channel, so consider subscribing. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.